Hi, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on the impact evaluation of the eSchool 360 program organized by American Institutes for Research. I'm here joined together by three fellow panelists, Molly Jameson Eberhardt of the EdTech Hub, Reshma Patel of Impact Network, and Alejandro Ganimian of New York University. We will be talking today about the results and policy implications of the impact evaluation of the eSchool 360 program in Zambia. My name is Thomas de Hoop. I'm a principal economist at the American Institutes for Research. I am also the principal investigator of the study. I think everybody by now probably has a lot of experience with these kinds of webinars in Zoom, but I just wanted to also let you know that any questions can be asked in the chat. We will start with a presentation by Reshma Patel about the program, followed by a presentation from myself about the impact evaluation and the results of the impact evaluation, after which Molly will provide some reflections of the program. I also see we had some connection problems, but I now see also that Mr. Mutale, who's speaking here on a personal capacity, has joined us here as a fellow panelist as well from Zambia. And Molly will provide some reflections, after which we'll have time for some questions. After that, Mr. Lancelot Mutale and Alejandro Ganimian will speak also with their reflections, both from the perspective of the Zambian education system, as well as the more academic literature on technology and education, and to what extent Impact Network addresses an evidence gap in that space. Thanks all for attending. I don't know whether there's anything else apart from the fact that we're recording. That's just something important to also mention. We will be recording this webinar and it will be made available after the webinar as well. I don't think there's anything else to discuss. I think we will just start with the webinar for now. So I'm going to give the floor to Reshma. Reshma, I will share my screen since we will be having one PowerPoint.
Sure. Thank you so much, Thomas, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining from, and we're really thrilled to have you here. So I'm the Executive Director for Impact Network, and my name is Reshma Patel. And as we sort of get started, I just wanted to start with a few notes on the context of education in Zambia and the way that Impact Network operates, and I'll move on to discuss the program that was evaluated by colleagues at American Institutes for Research. And so while primary school enrollment is relatively high in Zambia, education quality is low. And so what we see, you can see some quick stats up on your screen, literacy rates for women are around 59% and for males are around 70%, and that's for ages 15 to 24. And it's also despite an average years of education in 7 to 8 years range. So attendance has largely, access to education has largely not been solved, but definitely have made strides. I think what we're seeing is now that the quality of education is sometimes quite low. And so what we do is we work in community schools largely. And so in around the 1990s, communities across Zambia started partnering with NGOs, international organizations, and their own communities to improve educational access. And they did that by using this community school structure. And largely it started without a ton of guidance or sort of resources from the government. And these community schools were largely built in rural areas and run by the community. So communities would be responsible for hiring teachers and paying them. Often there were volunteer teachers. And then as a result of that, they didn't tend to get a ton of resources. And this community school structure has grown a lot. So it started with probably about 100 schools in the mid-90s to around 2,500 schools now. And that's likely an undercount just because there's a large number of informal schools that pop up, especially in rural areas. And so in a lot of ways, that increase has been quite positive. So there's close to 500,000 children that now have access to an education and are able to attend school. But without consistent funding, without qualified teachers, or at least teachers that are given some guidance and support, and often without school supplies or a management structure or sort of guidance on curriculum, a lot of community schools have fallen into disrepair. And so that's sort of the context in which we work. We work largely in community schools. And then in terms of the evidence, I think there is some evidence that integrating technology can improve, education and learning outcomes. But there is limited evidence in sub-Saharan Africa more broadly, but especially in some of these more rural areas. And that's sort of the surrounding area and framework that we operate in. Our flagship program is called the eSchool 360, and Impact Network really developed this to be a holistic education program that's centered on empowering teachers with technology, with activity-based lessons, and with weekly coaching and support. And so while we feel that technology is not necessarily a silver bullet into solving all of the world's problems, we definitely believe that it can be leveraged to increase quality while keeping costs low. So our eSchool 360 system basically provides locally hired teachers with a number of tools. One of those tools are tablets and projectors, and our tablets are loaded with content from WABU, or iSchool as it's known in Zambia. And we also supplement the WABU curriculum with some of our own content, with collaborations with the government, such as teaching at the right level and catch up. And largely these tablets have lesson plans and lessons on them that are really activity-based. So they're designed around group work. They're really created to engage students rather than sort of the rote memorization and repetition that often happens. And they're also available, especially for grades 1 to 4, in local languages. So we teach in the local language in the areas that we work, which is largely Chinyanja. We supplement all that with a really comprehensive teacher training and coaching program where teachers are observed and they're given feedback in real time on their progress, and they're sort of coached every week or every other week through this process. We have oversight and management. We work largely with the community, and we have a PTA and family engagement days where we really work with the parents in our communities to improve what we do. And each student gets, the school supplies they need, and our schools are powered by solar power to allow the tablets and projectors to be used. And then we also provide sort of security. And the goal around all this is that, we just didn't believe that we could just drop the technology into the schools, but we thought that the tools that were available to teachers on them were really helpful. And, they teach all these different concepts in a variety of different ways. And so we always aim to create a really scalable program that could increase education quality at a low cost. And so we've been aiming for about $5 a month per student. And Thomas is going to speak, I'm sure, shortly, that there is going to be a cost study component of what AIR is working on. And just to note quickly on the population, so we work in some of the hardest to reach areas. So there's largely no running water. Our school is often the only source of electricity in the communities that we work. And we did a survey internally last year and found that our students are walking an average of about 30 minutes each day, each way to school. But within that estimate, there's a ton of variability. So some students are walking, 5-10 minutes to get to school, and some students are walking up to 2 to 3 hours each way to get to school. And so there's a large number of barriers to overcome in the areas that we're working with, but I just wanted to mention a little bit about the population. We do provide schooling from grades 1 to 7, and then we're rolling out an early childhood program next year. So yeah, I'll stop there and hand it over to Thomas, who will speak obviously more about the evaluation.
Thank you so much, Reshma, for that introduction to the program. And since Reshma already spoke so much about the program, I will not speak so much about the program. Instead, what I will do is I will start with a theory of change we created in close consultation with Impact Network. We co-created this theory of change based on an existing theory of change that the eSchool 360 program already had. And we really started with the idea in mind, there are certain challenges within the current education system that need to be addressed. And in many other low and middle income countries, we're working in a context with low literacy rates, with low levels of reading and mathematics achievements. And specific to the context of Zambia, community schools that receive only limited funding from the government. There's also an increasing number of community schools. So community schooling in that respect in the context of Zambia becomes increasingly important in the current context. And within those communities, oftentimes they have untrained and underpaid teachers that do not always have the right skills to teach in the Zambian curriculum. So what Impact Network really aims to achieve is improvements in the quality of education by close engagement with the ministry and through a multifaceted program that includes a large technology focus, but that's certainly not the only thing. Certainly the technology wherein teachers are provided with tablets is an important part of the program. But in addition to that, Reshma was already speaking about that, it's really critical for Impact Network that it really focuses on an activity-based learning program. There's a large focus on teacher professional development, wherein teachers receive weekly coaching and monthly training. Their parent-teacher associations are being created, and on top of that, but it's really to serve as a complementary tool, there is an introduction of e-learning. And all of that is on top of the fact that school infrastructure of community schools is improved in a first phase. And in addition to that, Impact Network provides free education. The idea behind all of that is that in the current context of Zambia, these improvements in activity-based learning and through an e-learning program can really help improve learning outcomes, for example, reading as well as literacy. But in addition to that, one key thing is also because of the fact that the community schools, their infrastructure improves, and because of the improvements in quality of education, and because of the free education, there may also be increases in the attendance and the enrollment in education. So basically the program, if you think about it in terms of how it can improve learning outcomes, it's basically through two main channels that we're talking about. The first channel is really through improvements in school attendance and school enrollment because of the improvements in quality. And so that is really through the fact that students are spending more time in school. And the second is really through improvements in the quality of education itself, which can then lead to improvements in learning outcomes. So how did we try to examine these hypotheses? What we really did is we implemented a cluster randomized control trial with the idea that we would randomly assign, we started with the process with Impact Network, wherein we initially identified 149 schools in the 3 districts, Petro, Kasinda, and Katete districts, where we were planning to work. Of those 149 schools, we identified 63 schools that met the inclusion criteria. Other schools had too many government teachers or no formal structure, or the school was closed, for example. And because Impact Network was only able with their resources to work in 30 schools, we decided to randomly assign 30 of those 63 schools to the program, and 33 of those students to a control group. And we did that in a random fashion, so that students who are enrolled in the Impact Network schools are similar to the students in the control group. Importantly, however, we did this 7 months before this random assignment before the start of the program. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of activity going on in the villages before or after the random assignments. And So what we did is we also sampled then all students who were eligible to enroll in first grade. And the main reason is because we previously identified the fact that the Impact Network program cannot only result in improvements in the quality of education, but may also result in changes in the composition of schools. So even if we would randomly assign the program to schools and we would actually just look at students, and we would compare students in Impact Network schools with students in community schools in the control group, they would actually still not be comparable to each other, because the program by itself leads to a change in the composition. So for that reason, we really focused specifically on children of 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 8-year-old, and 9-year-old that were eligible to enroll in first grade. And regardless of whether they enrolled in school, we compared the students that were in the treatment group to the student, or the children in the treatment group to the children in the control group. And eventually we ended up with like 62% of the students that enrolled in school in the treatment group, which is about 8 percentage points higher than in the control group, which already provides some indication that the composition also changed. And we had a sample size of 888 versus 977 students. Then in 2018, the beginning of that year, we conducted child assessments at baseline, as well as at midline, in 2019, and we conducted AGRA, early grade reading assessments, or ECMA, early grade math assessments, the Zambian achievement test, as well as the oral vocabulary test. We administered each of those in Njanja. We conducted those assessments with 1,865 children during the baseline and 1,700 children during the midline. And the midline was conducted 14 months after the baseline. We did not find any evidence for differential attrition. So 165 students did not take that took the assessments at baseline, did not take the assessments at midline, but those numbers were equal between the treatment and the control group on average. So we compared the outcomes of the eligible children in the treatment and control areas at midline. And in addition to that, that enabled us to identify the so-called intention to treat effect, which is a weighted average of the effect for those children that did and that did not enroll in school. And in addition to that, we also conducted statistical analysis to specifically estimate the effect on children enrolled in treatment schools in the last year, as well as those children that attended treatment schools for 3 or more days in the week before the survey. We complemented all of that with midline qualitative data as well. We did not collect qualitative data at baseline, but we did so at midline. And we conducted key informant interviews with teachers, teacher supervisors, and Impact Network staff, as well as focus group discussions with parents, PTA members, and students, as well as classroom observations. So what did we find? I'm immediately jumping to the results here. So really what we found after 14 months, and we estimated effects in 2 ways. The first one is that, like all of these assessment tests, we can estimate the percentage of questions that are correct for each student. And depending on the assessment tests, which each have their strengths and weaknesses, with early grade reading assessment and early grade math assessments being like internationally validated, the Zambian achievement test, a locally validated tool, and oral vocabulary, specifically focusing on oral vocabulary. Depending on the test, we found effects of about 3.5 to 6.0 percentage points that were statistically significant. So each of the students improved in regardless, this was for the sample of children, regardless of whether they entered school or not. So these are reasonable effect sizes, especially they actually look larger if you look at the standard deviations. Researchers like to look at these effects in standard deviations because that makes them comparable across contexts. And there we actually find that the effects on AGRA are 0.40 standard deviations. If you look at the percentage points, the effects actually don't look so large. If you look at the standard deviations, these effects are considerable in comparison with the literature, especially the impact estimate of 0.40 standard deviations, especially considering the fact also that we look at the weighted average for students, for children who do and who do not enroll in first grade at that point. So looking further at like the effect specifically for those children who were ever enrolled in Impact Network schools, the effects slightly increase, unsurprisingly, and they move to around 5.2 to 10.1 percentage points. And here the effect sizes in standard deviations actually increase to around to a range from 0.26 standard deviations for the Zambian achievement test to about 0.68 standard deviations for the early grade reading assessments. So to conclude, like after 14 months, we find positive effects on learning levels, but at the same time, we also see that the learning level in terms of like the percentage of questions that students had correct were relatively low still at midline. So we're talking about effect sizes that lead eventually the children in the Impact Network catchment areas. So to have a score of about 11% correct on early grade reading assessments and 24% correct on early grade math assessments. So that still leaves a lot of room for improvement in the future. So what we really want to do, like in the next year or so, like we want to estimate impacts after like another period of implementation. And we want to see whether those effects can increase in the long term as well. It's possible that like the COVID situation currently may limit our ability to detect these like exponentially increasing learning outcomes, one hypothesis that we really want to test. But in addition to that, we also want to examine the cost effectiveness of the program. Reshma was already mentioning that currently the program costs about $5 per month per student, and a non-experimental previous study of the Impact Network program before the scale-up shows some evidence for low costs and high cost effectiveness in comparison with government schools. The Endline study will also, as I already mentioned, assess the ability of the program to exponentially increase learning outcomes after 4 years of programming. We're excited about these results, but we also want to see like whether this really leaves room for more improvement, considering the fact that students still score relatively low on early grade reading and early grade math assessments in comparison with the level where they're supposed to be. So thanks so much. I just wanted to let you know also, like I'm presenting this, but this is really joint work with Hannah Ring, with Garima Sibach of American Institutes for Research, as well as Paula Diaz, Victoria Roodbaert, and Anais Tungui. And in addition to that, we're also working very closely with Gelson Tambo and his team at Palm Associates in Zambia. So thanks very much. I will stop the presentation here and give the floor also to Molly, who will give some reflections on the results of the program.
Thanks very much, Thomas. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you. My name is Molly Eberhardt, and I am the Director of Engagement for the EdTech Hub. We are a global research partnership that is working to empower people making decisions about technology and education. So as you might imagine, are very interested in studies like this one, which add to a relatively limited evidence base about what can make an ed tech intervention successful. So with thanks to Thomas for sort of those very detailed look at the methodology and the results, very much looking at learning outcomes, I wanted to take a moment to zoom out a little bit and look at some of the principles of effective and scalable ed tech interventions. None of you will be surprised to hear me say that there is fairly limited evidence about EdTech, and especially about EdTech operating at scale in low and middle income countries. So because of that, what we at the EdTech Hub and colleagues have been doing is turning to a set of principles that we think make interventions more likely to be impactful. I would like to share these with you so that we can think about the eSchool 360 results sort of in the context of this wider framework. Some of the principles that we look at, starting with the top row here, have to do about applying pedagogical expertise about how we know kids learn, regardless of whether we're talking about technology or not. We also are looking at interventions that have been designed and updated and iterated So here are the principles that we've developed for effective and scalable EdTech interventions. I already started to talk through the first couple, so applying pedagogical expertise, designed alongside users like teachers, caregivers, and other officials, not to mention children. Looking at content that is open source and easily editable and translatable. Delivering content through multiple modalities so that in some settings might include online, but in many settings will need to include different types of hardware that allow for low connectivity, as Reshma described, is very much the context in the community schools that Impact Network is operating in. We're looking for interventions that adapt to learners' needs and allow teachers to support the adaptation of content to children's needs. We're also looking at cost effectiveness and financial sustainability. So this is something that Thomas alluded to, and hopefully there's room for further research there. Uses available hardware and works offline. I think that's something that Reshma made pretty clear, something that's been a focus for eSchool 360, which is great to hear. It's aligned with curriculum. One that's really important because when people start talking about ed tech, sometimes people start to think very much about one device per child, where a child is having a completely self-contained experience. A lot of the evidence that we see is that actually any ed tech intervention can be improved and is more impactful, and sometimes even only impactful if it is facilitated by a human, right? Facilitated by a teacher or some other facilitator. It could be a caregiver, for example. Importantly, we also think about things like addressing safeguarding, embedding interventions in a wider system, and of course, informed and continuously adapted based on emerging evidence. So the principles on the right-hand side here, many of you will find familiar from the digital principles that we've kind of given an education-specific tweak to. But I thought it would be useful to think about these in the context of the findings and the extent to which we think this framework is useful for looking at the kind of changes that we've seen that can be attributed to the eSchool 360 model. The last thing I want to say is to kind of raise a couple questions that maybe we can talk about in the discussion and that I think will link really nicely into what Alejandro is about to talk to us about, which is thinking about what we mean by an ed tech intervention. Does this study add to the education evidence base? Certainly. I think there's no doubt about that. But a more difficult and perhaps more interesting question is this an ed tech intervention? When we look at this kind of long list of a holistic approach that Reshma presented to us at the beginning of today, a lot of this uses technology, but a lot of it doesn't use technology at all, and it is embedded in a holistic system. So are we really evaluating an ed tech intervention, or are we looking at an education intervention that uses tech in some places? I might argue, going on to my third question here, that there should perhaps be no such thing as an ed tech intervention if we think of it simply as a piece of technology applied in a place. But really what we should be thinking about is interventions like this one, where it is an education intervention that uses tech in specific ways towards specific outcomes. And so what I would love to kind of hear is Thomas, maybe comment some more on during the discussion session, or maybe Alejandro will get to it, is to what extent, and maybe this is an area for future research, can we start to get at what is the contribution of each of these elements and of the technology components in particular to the impact that we're seeing? And is there a way to tease that apart so we can think about where technology might be supporting improved quality teaching, et cetera, and where we might be able to scale and replicate that in other contexts? So just a few questions to kind of get everyone's juices flowing for the discussion session. And with that, I'll hand it over to Alejandro.
Molly, I think we will first go to a number of questions that will be asked right now in a first round of questions. I don't know whether I have already been any questions from the audience. I'm also happy to respond to some of the questions you raised during your discussion, and maybe Reshma and Alejandro may also have some thoughts, although I also don't want to steal the thunder of Alejandro, who will talk about this a little bit later. But I wonder whether there have been any questions from the audience or that we can address at this point already. I see one question from Zarko, for example. on the exponential increase of learning outcomes, but maybe there are other questions as well. Feel free to also put them in the chat right now.
I wonder, Molly, if you want to answer the question on the exponential increase of learning outcomes, how it's defined, and what's the advantage of assessing an exponential increase versus increase. I guess I'm not exactly clear whether that was for Molly or for Thomas, but I'm just putting a prompt in.
Yeah, I'm happy to reflect on that. I think like we certainly see like a positive impact of this program. And like there are various other interventions, not just EdTech, but like other interventions, especially, for example, those that focus on like structured pedagogy, that really like show like relatively like large positive effects on learning outcomes, both literacy and mathematics and other types of learning outcomes. But especially when we say large, what we often mean is like something around like 0.40 standard deviations. Like a recent evidence synthesis by David Evans on like education interventions in low and middle income countries shows that there are only very few interventions that show these kinds of effects of either like 0.3 standard deviations or 0.4 standard deviations even. Like there are only very few of those interventions that actually achieve these impacts. When we look at our study, like in the context of Zambia, like those kinds of effects are great, but they still don't really bring us to where we want to be in terms of learning outcomes. It still means, especially that students are really still achieving relatively low learning outcomes at this point. And like if we really want to achieve to learning levels where students want to be or need to be to like achieve like education objectives, then it's not just sufficient to actually improve learning outcomes like with the way it currently goes. That means that learning outcomes need to increase further over time. And basically the learning outcomes that students have achieved now will be beneficial in having like further increases in learning outcomes. That's a very ambitious goal. I'm not sure whether it's achievable, but it's an important hypothesis to test.
Thanks,
I also see a question about, to Molly, what are the active ingredients to successful use of technology to improve education in resource limited settings?
Yeah, thanks. So what was it, 1, 2, 3, about 10 principles I shared with you, we would say are many of the important ingredients, but some of them focus on things that are more about an enabling environment than the actual impact on learning. So let's focus in specifically on those that might be most relevant to learning. Those, I think, are perhaps unsurprisingly the same active ingredients as you would expect in any education intervention that didn't include tech. So is there an ability to assess where kids are and therefore meet their needs and target the instruction to that level? So sort of meeting the children's needs and then adapting as those needs change. This is especially hard, as a former teacher in a classroom of 30 where that felt really difficult. You can imagine as a teacher in a classroom of 80 how difficult that is. So can technology help with that? I think is one of the questions. I think that targeted instruction is definitely one of the active ingredients. The other one, I think, is really about this point about how the teacher or facilitator role is envisioned and how quality instruction, which we all know is important to learning outcomes and effective teacher practices, can be enhanced by technology as opposed to any sort of kind of replacement mechanism there. So how could technology help us increase the quality and scalability of that quality for things like not only content, but ways of teaching, checks for understanding, encouraging peer collaboration and dialogue, that kind of thing that we know works outside of the technology setting. There's a couple of thoughts on those active ingredients, and I'm happy to share. I know that we'll share the decks afterwards so that you can see the full list of them.
I also saw a question about the effect of school closure from Jasmine. And Reshma, I don't know whether you maybe you don't feel comfortable about like how it will be taken into consideration in the analysis, but maybe you can say a little bit about how you're currently addressing some of the challenges with school closure.
Yeah, absolutely. So schools closed in Zambia, and similar to a lot of other countries in context, around March, mid-March, and we sent students home with sort of care packages that included soap, health information about COVID, as well as, stay-at-home packs, not knowing how long they would be home for. And then in the first, I'd say 4 to 6 weeks of the closures, we partnered with Rising Academies to start a radio program. So we translated and adapted content that has been used in Liberia for just basic literacy and numeracy lessons in the local language and aired those in the Eastern Province. And that started in about June of this year, or late May. And we sort of paired that, when it became clear that the school closures were going to be lasting longer than we initially thought, we made more stay-at-home packs that were intended to be paired with listening to the radio. We also had teachers doing home visits, so going door to door to their students' home, checking in on their health and safety. As we know, child protection during school closures is a really big concern. So checking in on their health and safety, and if there was any concerns in the home, or if there was any food needed, or basic needs that weren't being met. And they also sometimes brought a chalkboard so they could do little tutoring sessions with students who might have been having trouble with their homework or with some concepts on the radio. And so the large, one of the main goals of all these different pieces, the stay-at-home packs, the radio, the home visits, was just to provide avenues of student engagement and to encourage them to come back when schools open. I think the avenues for remote learning in rural contexts are really limited. And the avenues for remote learning, even in the best contexts, are limited, I think, by what we're learning over the last 6 months during the pandemic. So one of our main goals was to try and keep the teacher, student, and school student connection so that students return to school. And then we feel like we can catch them up in the ways we need to. We can assess where they're coming in at after the pandemic. And so schools reopened in Zambia about 4 weeks ago now. And so we've just completed our own internal assessment to try and understand where kids are literacy and numeracy wise. And we have a long road ahead of us to try and catch up on a lot of this learning loss that we know from the evidence base and from our schools that has taken place.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that, in terms of the analysis, we were originally supposed to start collecting data according to our original plans in around 2 months from now or so. But we have postponed the data collection to a moment where students have at least had 12 months of uninterrupted education. So by expectation, I anticipate that we will collect new data in about a year from now. We did not feel that impact estimates at this point, after so much learning loss has likely taken place, may be as relevant as the impact estimates in about a year from now. Of course, what we will also do is make sure that we ask a lot of questions about what happened during the COVID periods, both at the school level and at the student level. Our next round of qualitative data collection will probably also pay close attention to how COVID has affected education. And we will the radio campaign, one thing to keep in mind here is that this was not only in the treatment schools that this happened, but that it happened both in or that control schools also had access to it. That doesn't mean that we are estimating the impact of a slightly different program, you could say, during the next round of data collection, because it's both the regular programming that we're evaluating, as well as the programming that is currently taking place in the treatment schools. Obviously, that complicates the interpretation of the intervention. I also see a question about assuming the intervention is beneficial, we actually deprive the control group of a beneficial intervention. I don't think that's the case in this case, because we really only had resources to provide the intervention to 30 schools. In addition to that, of course, there is some evidence from a previous study, from a non-experimental study, that the intervention did have benefits, but those but those benefits were not as clearly established. And I think like before the intervention started, like considering the evidence base that we're in, we really didn't know yet whether the intervention, what their effects were. And like, I think it's also ethically important to really make sure that we actually improve the evidence base on education in emergencies precisely for ethical reasons, so that we can deliver higher quality education to students in the future as well. I think we are about time probably for Alejandro's and Mr. Mentales' presentation.
Hi, everyone. First off, thanks to AIR for the invitation today. I want to do three things in my presentation. First, I want to give you a framework to think about how this intervention fits into the global evidence in education technology. Number two, I want to tell you about some of the challenges that make this intervention sort of difficult to pinpoint in terms of impact, following up on the conversation that Molly had started. And then I want to tell you about what are the main insights that I draw from this intervention for the global evidence and some of the questions that I have related to the evidence piece. So let me get started. So last month, a couple of colleagues at the Brookings Institution at the American American Enterprise Institute, Emiliana Vegas and Rick Hess, respectively, and I co-authored a report on how to make the best out of education technology into school systems that is available on our Brookings website. Here, I just want to give you a snapshot of the framework that we put together in that report. And the framework asks the question, how can EdTech complement regular, let's call it chalk and talk instruction? And we've identified 4 main comparative advantages that technology has to complement regular instruction. That includes scaling up standardized instruction. That means taking what we think are good instructional material and practices and take it to scale so that it can be accessed by more students and teachers. And we're providing some ways in which that can be achieved in the sub-bullets below. The second one is to expand opportunities for practice. You know, many of our developing countries are have very large class sizes and have very lecture style lessons. So the opportunities for practice from students might not be as much as we want them to be during the lesson. So technology can help us expand on that after or before the lesson. The third comparative advantage is facilitating differentiated instruction. This is the area in which I've spent a lot of research sort of interest myself. So specifically on the question of computer adaptive learning, which I'm happy to go into in the Q&A discussion if useful. But basically, just to pick up on both what Reshma and Thomas were saying, the idea is that we're adapting not just the level of the material, but also sort of the rate at which it progresses to how the student is actually coping with the material. The faster the student understands the material, the faster the material progresses on, and so on and so forth. And another way is, of course, to do one-on-one tutoring, but that's we have far less evidence on that. Finally, we can increase student engagement, and we can do that in a couple of ways. The one that probably most of you are familiar with are video tutorials of the type of Khan Academy, but also we can do that through games or gamification, not the same thing. So gamification is just the integration of game-like features into the learning process. For example, leaderboards or rewards for students for understanding a specific unit. So that's kind of the framework. So where does the program that we're discussing today fit into this framework? Well, I would argue that it fits into the first comparative advantage, which is how to take, let's call it good instruction to scale, right? Now, it's often difficult for the reasons that both Reshma and Molly were mentioning to evaluate an intervention that has so many components, as in the case of eSchool 360, because any component could be driving positive effects, one or more components could be having no effect at all, and some components could actually be having a negative effect, even if the net effect of the intervention is positive, as Thomas showed us. I think this is less of a problem here because of a few reasons. So The main component, which is the tablets and the projectors that are loaded with lessons for students and the plans for teachers, seek to mainly ensure that classes are based on materials that have undergone some form of quality review by a local team. So all the other components that Reshma was introducing and then Molly was reviewing, such as electricity and solar power, teacher training, and community ownership, seem to try to see, okay, how can we support that main goal of getting quote unquote good instruction into more students and more teachers. So I would say that even though we have all those possible mechanisms of impact that Tom has outlined in his presentation, they're mostly pursuing one main theory of change, which is how to deliver vetted content to a large number of schools, teachers, and students. Now, what have I learned from this, and what are my questions following this evaluation? So I think first and foremost, it shows that when materials are of high quality and appropriate for students, they can support regular instruction. And this is quite interesting in and of itself, but because if you look at the sort of the rigorous evidence on this question, the evidence is quite mixed. So some programs that do something very similar to eSchool 360, such as the one evaluated by colleagues of mine in Punjab, Pakistan, have not worked, or have worked very well, excuse me. Some others that do exactly the same, such as the one done by Avanti in Haryana, India, have not worked. And then others sort of like add to this dilemma of a positive effect and negative effect. So just knowing, having another program that actually works in this direction is useful. I think that I would be interested in understanding sort of a little bit more about the content of the lessons and the tablets and the projectors. So is it about the alignment with the official curriculum that matters? Is it about the pedagogical strategies that are sort of embedded in those lessons and lesson plans that matters? Is it about the fact that they're delivering this instruction in local language? The second part is that I think it shed lights on the characteristics of the families that take up this tech-enabled interventions. Thomas went through this very quickly, but I think a very important feature of this evaluation is that they're not only collecting data on those who take up the programs and those who do not, but also on everyone else that lived in that community, right? So very few studies have been able to compare the characteristics of beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries of an EdTech intervention. And I think this is important for questions regarding equity, right? So the authors say that more families with higher education and higher socioeconomic status tended to take up this intervention. And I just would like to know more about why. Is it about an intrinsic motivation difference? Is it about how they perceive the program? Is it about how they value education or the EdTech components? And then just two final points. One of them is it reminds us of the importance of take-up for effectiveness. Now, this might seem like a completely trivial point, but actually it's not. There are many well-meaning EdTech interventions that have actually failed to engage students as intended. So the fact that in this evaluation, it shows that more students are going to school, and the more they're doing that, they're learning, that is quite important. And they comparing any attendance with 3 days of attendance per week. But I would like to understand a little bit more how that progression happens from any attendance to middle attendance to regular attendance to everyday attendance. And then finally, I think it also illustrates the importance of parent buy-in, right? So there's a very large research outside of the EdTech world demonstrating that parents, unsurprisingly, do not just care about test scores when deciding where to send their kids to school. So the evaluation didn't just find that the program worked, but that it also improved parental perceptions of school quality and led them to send their kids to school more. That is an important insight. So I think I would be very curious to learn more about just the components of the intervention that maybe were most or least valued by parents, just to inform how to sustain this parental engagement. Is it about the infrastructure, what we all can see? Is it about the use of technology, which they think is valuable for the job market or education? Or is it about other parts of the school improvement process, such as the teacher training? That's basically all I had for today, and I'm happy to engage further in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro. And I think we have Mr. Lancelot Mutala also, who is going to give some more insights into how the study also connects to some of the challenges that the Zambian education system is currently experiencing. Giving the floor to him.
Thank you so much, and thanks everybody for inviting me. I would also like to thank, I've seen that there is some lady that I was in the office with, Yoshi. Hama, who is in this group as well. And so thanks, Rashma, for the invitation. And I just have two slides. Many of the things that I'm going to talk about have in fact already been discussed by the other panelists, and so just goes to add my voice to what has already been observed. The first thing I would like to indicate is that unlike when the community schools first started in the 1990s, a number of the community schools now do have trained teachers on government payroll. But the fact still is that these will be very few. In such a school, we might find maybe one or two trained teachers on government payroll, and then the rest are not trained and are just providing voluntary services, and they're just paid in kind. And by the way, I'm not referring to schools supported by Impact Network, but generally community schools in Zambia. So now the problem that has been there with the introduction of the trained teachers in these community schools is like, a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's good because you do have somebody who is trained teaching these children. On the other, those that are not on payroll, those that have not received any training, feel that they're just being exploited and not appreciated because their friends are getting money at the end of each month and they themselves are not getting anything. So they tend to get frustrated and they stop or they go somewhere else. And this is what we have experienced before. And also, the other thing is that in schools where you have community school teachers exclusively that are not trained but have been engaged by the community, the level of commitment is quite high. And that explains why in many cases, children in community schools tend to perform even better than those in government schools. It's because of the level of the level of commitment on the part of the teachers that have been engaged by the community. So when a trained teacher comes who is on government payroll, they feel that they are not answerable to the community, and therefore they tend not to work well with the community. The second challenge that I have also noticed is now with the COVID-19 that has come in, schools have been closed for a long time. Of course, now they have reopened, but they lost a total of 15 weeks. Here in Zambia, our school term is 13 weeks. So schools closed in term 1 of 2020 in the 11th week. So it means they lost 2 weeks of that term. And also they have lost a whole 13 weeks of term 2 only to open in term 3. And term 3 itself will only have 11 weeks, which is not enough. And what has compounded the problem is that government has instructed all schools not to have in any given class more than 23 children. This is to allow for social distancing. So in a situation where you have, say, 60 or 80 children, it means they have to be split into 4. And then classroom space becomes a big, big challenge. And so we have quite a number of children receiving maybe 2 or 3 hours of instruction per day for 2 days in a week. The other 2 days is given to other children who had no opportunity in the first part of the week. So this means that we are further lowering the pupil-teacher contact time. And so this problem is likely to go on until government allows the ministry to get back to normal. What is also gratifying, though, is that COVID-19 cases in the country have been reducing drastically. And in fact, some of the centers that had been opened as COVID treatment centers have since been shut down because of no cases being reported there. So that is the good part. And we are in summer, so we think that if this continues, then things could be better for us this side of the globe. The other challenge that we note is the lack of IT in our schools. most of the schools, and I know, you guys know about this, do not have the necessary infrastructure, let alone the IT, like computers, like even radios in some cases are difficult to get in these rural areas, and even in the urban areas is also difficult. There's a challenge of textbooks, of course, that are grossly inadequate in many of the schools as well. So, and the last challenge that I have noted, of course, there are many. I just singled out a few of these. That is that community members don't seem to be as actively involved in the education of their children as they should be. So those are the challenges. So if I go to the next slide, the last slide that I have on what I'm proposing could be some of the things that we can do is that consideration should be made for the use of social media groups such as WhatsApp for teachers. We have noticed this even in the project where I work. Most of the teachers now in many of the districts, especially in this case where Impact Network are operating in Eastern Province, nearly all teachers now do have WhatsApp groups. And even in places where connectivity is very poor, they do occasionally move to those places, or is it anti-hills, where they will find the internet connectivity, and then they're able to link up with their friends. So a lot of messages now are sent. For example, the DEBS office, the DEBS in a particular province will have their own WhatsApp group. Head teachers will have their own WhatsApp group, and even zone insight coordinators or district resource center coordinators do have these WhatsApp groups. So I feel that these could greatly be made use of to the advantage of the IT itself. This is one of the IT things that we can talk about, because now there is improved internet connectivity in many parts of the country. There's still a lot that don't have, but there are also quite a good number of places where there is internet connectivity now. And I also think that some of the other IT innovations for schools could be maybe, a procurement of simple gadgets like radios that have, provision for memory cards with lessons preloaded. And then these can be played by the teacher over and over to help the students as well as the teachers themselves in their pedagogical skills. So, and these radios are not expensive, because now there are these much smaller radios that have provision even for a USB, and so anything can be loaded there and then given out to the teachers. And there's also a number of organizations that are selling solar charging mechanisms that can easily be procured and given out to schools for their benefit in this regard. Now, what we've also noticed is that in the midst of this COVID, the radio tends to be a much better way of communicating with them, because about 20% of the people only have access to television, and maybe over 80% of the people do have radios in their places. And the community radio stations now do cover many parts of Eastern Province, as well as other parts of the country. So use of the community radio stations is very good, and you can have lessons preloaded and broadcast by the community radio stations at some fee, and is going to benefit all the children. Even stories can be read out, and the parents can participate. You can also have programs specifically targeted to the parents themselves. Now, we do have Zambia National Broadcasting Corporation, which is a national broadcaster, but this one does not cover a lot of places. So community radios are much better. And even now, the basic mobile telephones that the majority of Zambians do have now also have provision for radio. And in these villages, even if the actual biological father or mother don't have radio, the uncle nearby probably has a radio which this child can make use of. So we would have to consider seriously the use of radio. And we also talked about, talking about availing tablets to teachers, say on a higher purchase. If this can be arranged, you give out to the teachers and then they can pay in installments so that after some months of payment, then they own these tablets. So they can use these for purposes of planning their lessons, for purposes of recording this and that, and even maybe availing some of the tablets to the pupils or students themselves, in schools. Then finally, I talked about the community engagement for parents. I know that Reshma and others have already talked about this, but yes, I just want to emphasize the fact that if we engage the parents more, then we are more likely going to get better results, especially this time when there is COVID and there's very little face-to-face interaction in our community. So the use of radio to communicate to the parents, to encourage them so that they understand the value of education, and also that they should give their children an opportunity to have time while at home to do their studies, and also to assist their children with their homework. We used to have this program in Zambia on this home visitation as well, and also homework policy was there, and I'm sure it is still there. It just needs to be enhanced so that the parents can assist more. In an event that the parent is not well educated or not literate enough, then even a family member or a neighbor can provide this assistance. So this is where I will end my contribution. I thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I think there may be some other questions, but for myself, I also, now that Alejandro has presented, I thought it might also be a good moment to get back to some of Molly's earlier points. And Reshma, I don't know whether you have any reflections, like, is this an attack intervention really? Or like, it might be good to hear some of your reflections there as well.
Sure, yeah, I like Molly's provocative question. I don't know, I guess I don't know what people in the field think. I have always thought of us as an education intervention that uses technology, but I think anyone that's operating in the education space and running a school, obviously technology is not the only thing we use. So to me, that always felt fairly intuitive. I think ed tech is just a nicer, snazzier way of saying it. But I do think there's a distinction to be made, and I think it's one that we often have to make to funders, and I see Ian McFadden from MWABU also has a question there. That Ian is my colleague at MWABU, who did the work on partnering with the ministry and creating the content that's on the tablet and translating it and developing these lesson plans. I think there sort of is this distinction between the creators of the tech and the users of the tech. I think the way it works best is if there is as much collaboration between those two groups as possible in really specific ways. So obviously, I think Molly on her slide that had the 10 different pieces, there has to be interaction and engagement with teachers that are going to ultimately use the product. The other piece of it that I think is really critical, and this gets to Alejandro's points around the ed tech interventions, is the local language for us is sort of a non-starter. It's one of the reasons it is hard for the lower grades to use more broad scale ed tech that exists, so like Khan Academy or Prosem or what have you, just because we need something in the local language for those early grades. And then highly contextualized. MWABU worked in Zambia developing pictures and videos that look like Zambian kids and areas that look like they could be in Zambia. And I think that's a piece of it that makes EdTech more cumbersome. I would like to think that it really matters in terms of students seeing a reflection of themselves in their classroom. And so, obviously parts of these components you can't really tease out. So I think it's really hard for me to say what of that made the biggest difference. The other thing I would say about MWABU and how they've operated is the lessons are really activity-based. So I think they try and draw on what we've learned in the literature on how kids learn, and that you might learn a variety of ways, and how can we integrate that variety of ways in a very culturally different context and make it adapt it to make it better for that environment. So yeah, I guess that's what I would say, sort of wrapping up some of Alejandro's points and Molly's, and as well seeing Ian in the chat.
I was also wondering, keeping in mind Mr. Montale's presentation on some of the education challenges and some of the solutions he proposes, whether how you see the eSchool 360 program in that larger like context. Like, are you planning to integrate some of those interventions? Like, are there any ones that are particularly relevant for you, or are there challenges where you see that other solutions may potentially be required in addition to the eSchool 360 to address some of the challenges mentioned in the presentation?
Yeah, and I've known Mr. Montale a long time. He helped Impact Network start in Eastern many years ago. And so I think the COVID crisis has obviously changed the way every education program operates. And so I think, you know, the points about radio and community engagement that Mr. Montale raised are really critical. I mean, the radio in particular, you made the point about ZNBC in particular in Zambia, but we aired our radio shows through the local community-based radio networks and had a fair amount of reach within those networks. But, you know, the ideas around the WhatsApp group and how to better engage teachers in those settings, and also, you know, some of the ideas on renting out tablets, or, you know, using a tablet as a resource that could be more widely used, I think is something that WABU is definitely interested in doing as well. And so how do we potentially get this technology into more hands in a sustainable way? It's an interesting and hard question, but I think it's more salient now than it has been in the past. I'd also say that I think, you know, so now what, from Impact Network side, I think that obviously the evaluation has really given us some guidance on where we are at the midline point, as well as sort of where we need to grow. I think that, you know, you mentioned there's obviously room for improvement. And I think if you dive into the scales that were used and the subscales, we can see where we need to strengthen our own programs. And so we started to take a look this year at how we can supplement how we're teaching, especially literacy in the classroom at the grade 1 level. And part of the reason for expanding to early childhood, especially for us, was to better prepare kids to be in our grade 1 classroom and have some of the skills that would allow them to come in with higher levels of literacy. There is a gap between the levels of literacy and numeracy that they're coming in with, as seen by the baseline by AIR. And so I think using the evaluation to strengthen what we do at the same time as starting to try and build some of those networks. And, you know, we actually do operate in 5 government schools and work really closely with our district in terms of implementing our programs and seeing how can we better do this. You know, we constantly expose other teachers from other schools to the technology and to understand how it works and how it can be used. I think there's a great variation between what we do and what's possible in a classroom, both a government school and the other community schools. And I also think, you know, we use solar in our classrooms, but that's partly because we started, you know, 10 years ago doing this. There is a big push within the Zambian context to see, you know, rural electrification and see these community schools have access to electricity in certain parts. And so I think there is, in these different pathways, a partnering option with the ministry and with other NGOs that work in this space to expand the program or components of the program that make sense to the context that we're working.
Yeah, maybe one point of context as well to some of Reshma's comments. She was already mentioning the different subscores. I think one thing that I found very interesting in the evaluation as well is like so far I've only spoken about the aggregate effects on like aggregate agra scores. We actually found positive effects on all of the different agra components, which is, I don't think you see that often, that you find effects both on the easiest subscales of early grade reading assessments as well as on reading comprehension. Like, I'm not saying that those effects were the same, but like it does provide some extra context to the results. I also see one other question about, do the panelists see the role of technology increasing in rural schools? And if so, what should be done to improve the technology, to improve the learning outcomes? I think that was a question that was there for a while. I don't know, Mr. Mutale, is that something that you can speak to? Or Reshma herself?
Sure, Mr. Matale, are you able to unmute? We had some challenges with his connection earlier, so I wonder if that might be stopping him. I mean, I think it's definitely something that, you know, there's definitely interest in. There's logistical challenges that I think can be overcome. So, you know, especially during this crisis, with the idea of, you know, students or teachers borrowing tablets from a school center or a distribution center, similar to how you take books out of a library. And I think that the responsiveness of the tech to different evaluation outcomes is a really interesting thing to tease out. So, you know, if students had like a one-to-one assessment where an individual student is taking the assessment on the tablet, how that informs the next updates with the curriculum, or how quickly that feedback gets incorporated, is a really interesting piece to tease out for me in terms of how technology can further improve a product, at least once it's out there.
There's one other question about whether ethics-based, assuming the intervention is beneficial to students, is there a provision that intervention will be given to the control group as well? I think one key thing to take into consideration with these evaluations is that the evaluations really serves as an assessment of whether the intervention is appropriate to take to scale in community schools in Zambia, as well as in possible other school arrangement through an adapted model in Zambia as well. So like, it's very much the intention. I think one key question there is like, who will fund such a provision? Like in this case, it was American Institutes for Research who funded the intervention of Impact Network as well as the evaluation. And Reshma, I see that you have some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I guess I'm just happy to jump in at any point, but
yeah.
I think in terms of the expansion, the ways that the government in Zambia has decided to invest in community schools, I think Lancelot raised this earlier, which is often just stationing a trained teacher at the community schools, which, you know, in theory sounds like a way to potentially have some trickle down effects if you have a trained teacher there that's modeling for other teachers and potentially coaching untrained teachers in that space. I think that we have found, similar to the points that he raised, that it does create some conflict in the operation of the school, both with the community and with the other teachers. I think what we're proposing for community schools is another model that could be tested. I think right now we are seeing largely that the government is aiming to improve or to increase the number of trained teachers at community schools. But I think what we've shown is that there is another way to improve quality at community schools. And my guess is that the cost study by AIR will show that it's more cost effective actually to run a program that hires and works with untrained teachers and provides them with tools and coaching in order to improve their skills. I mean, that's I guess the bet that Impact Network is making. But I think that there's ways that the government wants to invest in community schools right now. It just doesn't have the funding to do it as widespread as they would like. And so I think an evaluation of this kind and an intervention like Impact Network really provide a framework for that and setting it up for the future.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we're also at time. I think maybe this is the moment to also thank everybody for their participation in the webinar. Thanks also much for the excellent question. Thank also to Mr. Matale, Molly, and Alejandro also for their excellent presentations as panelists. It's given us a lot of food for thought on how to use the evaluation findings and also for the evaluation in the future. And I'm sure Reshma also has some food for thought for some of the implementation of the program as well. And thanks also much. Would also be happy. You can also find both the reports as well as the policy brief about the evaluation on the AIR website. And yeah, thanks also much for your participation. It was a pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you, Molly, Alejandro, and Mr. Matale.
Thank you so much as usual.
Thank you.